Hello, in this, the 101st episode of Airs for Architecture, I speak with Professor Sophia Psarra about the book Parliament Buildings, The Architecture of Politics in Europe, which Sophia edited with Uta Steiger and Claudia Sternberg and published with UCL Press in 2023.
A is for Architecture, a podcast about architecture, buildings, urban culture and space.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Airs for Architecture. I'm talking today to Sophia Psarra, author, academic, architect, about a recent book that you published called Parliament Buildings, The Architecture of Politics in Europe. But before we get into that, Sophia, would you be so kind as to introduce yourself?
Hello, thank you for inviting me. I'm really excited to be here and discuss with you the new book, which we co-edited with Uta Steiger and Claudia Sternberg, that are based in the UCL European Institute. So my name is Sophia Psarra, and I'm a professor of spatial design, architecture and spatial design at the Bartlett School of Architecture, where I teach and I also direct the PhD program, one of the PhD programs that we have on architectural and urban history and theory.
Fabulous. And are you an architect by training, or are you straight into history theory?
I am an architect by training. I did my first degree in Athens, in the National Technical University in Athens, after which I came to the UK to do postgraduate studies. And I practiced. I practiced in Greece and I practiced in London as well for the first years of my career. But as soon as I got my first appointment in the University of Cardiff, academic work absorbed me completely. I also taught design at the studio, and I'm teaching design in the MA course, Architectural and Urban Historic Environments at the Bartlett.
Fantastic. So you now sort of focus more specifically on architectural history and theory in your research work as well.
I focus on architectural history and theory, and I also research the contemporary dimensions of buildings as well, which is what this book is about.
Yeah, perhaps we can touch on that. It's a very interesting book, a collection of sort of 20-odd essays, isn't it, by various scholars.
33 essays.
33 essays.
Yes.
A lot of essays. It's dealing with this issue around Parliament buildings, and obviously in the UK at the moment that's high up in the public consciousness because of the incredibly expensive renewal of the Houses of Parliament, but has been something that's been in our mind for a long time, not least because of the Scottish Parliament building from 20 years back or so. But what drove the publication of this book?
In 2019, I'm trying to remember the dates well, I was invited by Grand Challenges at UCL to participate in a sandpit with the theme European Voices. And this was an initiative that UCL Grand Challenges established in order to celebrate and explore their links with Europe. So I participated in the sandpit and I got the funding. Before that, I was thinking European Voices, what that could be. And I thought, what would be the best possible place where voices are heard? And I thought Parliament buildings. So that's how it came up. I participated in the sandpit. I won the award in collaboration with Claudia Sternberg and Uta Steiger. And then we organized 2 virtual conferences because COVID started and the restrictions took place. So we moved ahead with virtual conferences. It was 2 conferences because the participation was so rich and wide from different disciplines that we could not accommodate everybody who had submitted an interest in abstracts in one conference. So we did one conference in November 2020 and the second one in February 2021. Following the conference, we proceeded with including most of those contributions into the publication of the book.
It's very nice to hear of an academic conference producing a substantial publication as well. I mean, that's like the dream, isn't it? It's much better than conference proceedings. And it is a really interesting, very, very diverse book. And I'm interested in that aspect of it as well, that the book is consciously not just by architects about architecture.
Yes, in a way, this was the natural outcome of the conference. The conference was framed as the intersection between architecture and politics, architecture and political culture, and the way in which we configured the call was, I guess, inviting to different disciplines, people from different disciplines to participate. I should say that the audience also was demonstrated wide participation, which was really interesting. We even had people from Parliament attending the audience, attending the conference, and one of the participants was from the House of Lords,
Mhm.
Philip Norton of Louth, who is also the director of Parliamentary Studies program in Hull University.
Mm.
So we attracted anthropologists, historians, art historians, people from the humanities, social sciences, and some academics from the field of architecture. But I should say that the book doesn't really lean towards one side or the other, architects or political scientists, or it is just, I think, equally um, uh, dedicated, yeah, to all these disciplines. In the second conference, I got in touch, before the second conference, I got in touch with Jeremy Melvin, who is very interested in the topic. He was very interested. So he proposed we organize a session with the architects of the Scottish Parliament building, the Senedd in Wales, and Paul Monaghan from AHMM, who was designing at that point in time a temporary chamber for the Commons, the UK Commons. And we also included David Nelson, who was the chief designer of the Reichstag building in Berlin.
I see.
So these were participations from architects that have contributed to the design and the construction of four contemporary designs, three of which have been realized.
Yes.
It
It's
was a
very,
very, very interesting session.
yeah, I can imagine so. And it's remarkable to have such, I suppose, esteemed people coming into a conference of this sort. What do you think the appetite was? Why do you think there's so much interest? Because there is a lot of interest around this topic at the moment. Why do you think particularly at this moment that this subject struck a nerve, so to speak?
It's a really interesting question. I think that, first of all, it's the restoration and renewal project that the UK House of Parliament are undergoing. And this obviously attracted a lot of interest.
Mhm.
I also believe that in the area of political science, political scientists and social scientists have been dealing with parliaments and parliament buildings, but there wasn't any explicit address of the building itself.
Mhm.
So that really instigated a lot of interest. Following the conference and the book, a number of political scientists that I got to know through the conference established more or less this field as their area of research, which I think is really interesting. So sometimes something happens and triggers this kind of response. But more generally, I think that the politics in worldwide now really question people's trust in politicians. Certain conditions, attacks to democracy, the hacking of public documents, issues regarding wide participation from different groups. They clearly demonstrate that the public loses confidence in democracy, and parliament buildings are the citadels of democracy. They are the symbols of democracy.
Mm.
So it is an interesting topic. Also, we are going through periods of social and economic restructuring, and the various political changes that take place around the world question the ways in which democracy operated in buildings that were built in the 18th and 19th century. And therefore, some are new, of course, and they are built in contemporary times. But nevertheless, it is a very important issue to consider. How would we design them?
Mhm.
What's going on inside these buildings? What's the relationship of the public to these buildings? Aspects of participation, aspects of public engagement with parliamentary democracy.
Mhm.
These are all, I think, very topical issues.
Mm. I like this idea that the political science field of political science hasn't particularly engaged with the buildings or with architecture, the architecture of democracy much, which from the perspective of people embedded in architecture schools is perhaps slightly scandalous that people haven't taken it more seriously. What we've been
Yeah,
trying to do.
yeah.
In the introduction to the book, you talk about, and other chapters within it, you talk about the idea of Parliament buildings being mediators of meaning, buildings in general being mediators of meaning. And this is obviously particularly so in the case of Parliament buildings, which are highly complex and, as you say, citadels or symbols of democracy. Is there an idea here that the buildings themselves, if properly understood, are actually devices of governance themselves, that they are more than just a space in which people gather and politics is done, but they themselves are part of the political rhetoric and system, I suppose, or process?
Yes, in a way, this also links with what you said before, that it is surprising that political scientists and social scientists have not addressed the building, but they address, the processes that take place inside the buildings, politics and the social process in general. It is, I think, related to the way in which the human mind works. Because it is very difficult to actually put in words spatial relationships and the ways in which they participate in the construction of spatial cultures inside buildings, in the ways in which the buildings are used, in terms of political culture and so on. We don't have words to actually describe complex relationships among spaces, but we act and use them competently and intuitively. So we tend to think that the building, not we as architects, but social scientists, for example, buildings and spaces are perhaps the background to human activity rather than active participants to human activity. So this is the way in which the work that I do looks at buildings as active agents of the social processes, rather than just the mere background to the social processes. This is one way in which buildings work as instruments, but then, of course, buildings work as symbols as well. And the symbolic function of buildings might have to do with their shape, with their appearance, with their aesthetics, and with the shape of spaces as well, not just the external appearance. And definitely, buildings are strong carriers of meaning in this way. So I don't play down this dimension of buildings in terms of how buildings mean, but I just emphasize those invisible aspects of meaning and use, simply because the complexity of spatial relationships is not easy to put in words.
That is very true. I've just been marking an essay by one of my master's students, and she's done a remarkably good job at doing it. And it's very rare to come across it. It's very, very complicated. And I was doing some research a couple of years ago around home, around the idea of home. And again, it's another one of these things where there is actually precious little work, substantive work done on spatial relationships. And I'd kind of like to understand that a little bit more. I suppose what do you mean when you're talking about the sort of the effectiveness of spatial relationships? What are we talking about here? The way that literally volumes are organized in relation to each other to produce certain social activities?
Yes, we talk about the ways in which spaces are put together, the ways in which they connect, the kinds of options they give to people to move, the complexity of these relationships in terms of moving inside a building. And these have embedded in them different potentials for movement and interaction. So, for example, if you are talking about a dead-end space, a space to which there is one door to enter and you exit from the same door, using the same door, this is a space which is not really conducive to movement, but to occupation. But if you're talking about a space that gives access to this dead-end space, this is a space that controls movement, controls access to that space. Like, for example, when you have an office and then you have a vestibule to the office. And sometimes you visit a person whose office that is, but there is somebody else that controls access to that office.
Hmm.
Like the staff, yeah, of a
Yeah.
person, or in a doctor's waiting area, yeah, before you enter the doctor's practice. So these spaces have different potentials. If a space gives many options to move, then obviously there are different opportunities for people to actually encounter each other.
Mm.
So these kinds of configurations of spaces allow different potentials to get realized.
Mm.
And we know, for example, for the way in which we use the buildings we use every day, like your college, for example, or the building where the Bartlett is based, I know which are the spaces where I meet most people.
Mm.
So if I want to meet people, I might, and I have time, I will really go and be in those places,
Hmm.
in these spaces. Of course, there are activities that are actually designed and programmed to allow the meeting of people. Like when you go to a lecture,
Mm.
it is highly likely you're going to meet a lot of people, a lot of your colleagues. But I'm sure there are spaces in your college where you meet your colleagues accidentally,
Mm.
simply because these are the spaces that people mostly pass through on their way to other spaces.
Yes, and you can see how that would work, particularly in a parliament building, where although the principal space is presented as being the debating chamber, in fact, most of the decision making occurs out with those spaces, beyond those spaces, in the corridors and meeting rooms and so on and so forth, that constitute the rest of the building. I mean, it's quite interesting, even as someone I suppose I haven't spent much time looking at, for example, the Houses of Parliament, not as much as I spent looking at the Scottish Parliament building, but I actually have no kind of mental image in my head of what that building is. I mean, I don't even know. Yeah, I have no mental image of it, and maybe that's egregious error on my part and an oversight on my part. But it's quite interesting that this idea that these parliament buildings, these conglomerations of spaces, may produce certain forms of political activity.
Yes, the UK House of Parliament is a very large and complex building.
Mm.
I don't know how many football pitches can fit into that building. I had read about that somewhere, but I don't remember how many. And it has a very interesting circulation system, which is very grid-like. It's
Mm.
almost like an urban system.
Hmm.
Uh, and when you look at the spaces, you realize that there are many ways to actually move through the building. Obviously, one needs to take into consideration who we are talking about, who the user is, because I, as a member of the public, when I step into that building, I cannot freely move inside it and use
Hmm.
all the potentials that the building offers to the people that use it, on a daily basis. But let's assume that we are regular users of the building, maybe we are members of staff. It allows many different ways to circulate, and these circulation patterns are intersecting with each other like rings of circulation. Yeah, like the central lobby. Take the central lobby, for example, that we can access as members of the public, and we can theoretically at least lobby our MP. This is a line at the main thoroughfare of movement from every place to every other place,
Hmm.
but also in rings of circulation. Yeah, so it is a very, very highly visited place, and a place where a lot of accidental encounters can take place.
And do you think, I mean, thinking of that particular building and perhaps comparing it to a more contemporary example, is there evidence that this was certain forms of interaction were designed in? Was it made more difficult, for example, for divisions between different political groups, parties, or so on? Because I can imagine in a building of the scale of the Houses of Parliament, it would be possible to move through that and never interact with a Conservative member of Parliament if you didn't ever want to. Or have they been designed so that this is kind of impossible?
Regarding whether they have been designed like that, I doubt whether Charles Barry and Pugin really had in mind the way in which I talk about the building now. I read somewhere that the building was designed for a parliament that was completely different in the 19th century. And the UK Parliament has undergone, an evolution, still being housed in a historical building. But
Mm.
in the 19th century, it was more or less designed for the ceremony of the state opening. And that was a time where the monarch had, and the lords had, in a way, presided over parliament, as opposed to what's going on now.
Hmm.
And in fact, if you look at the design of the building, it's similar. It's a very classical design, although in three-dimensional appearance is neo-Gothic. It's a very classical design, which has the central lobby at the center, and then the commons and the lords on either side. And then the area of the monarch for the state opening is more or less something like a backstage. And it lies away from the main thoroughfares of movement,
Mm.
obviously because of the uh, uh, sovereignty of parliament. Yeah.
Hmm.
That experience, what happened with, was it Charles I who was decapitated because he stormed the Commons chamber? That experience really marked the history of parliament after that.
Yeah.
And at the same time, to really eliminate any accidental and unwanted sort of events or encounters during the arrival of the monarch and the state opening. Regarding now whether buildings are designed like that, I think intuitively architects can really grasp what are the kinds of structures that can be, more probabilistic in nature in terms of enabling various forms of movement and circulation and encounters to take place, as opposed to buildings that need to be and have to be less so, because there are vested interests, there are security issues, there are professional issues that demand separation between different types of users, like in a hospital, for example,
Mm.
or like in law courts buildings and so on. Yeah. So buildings are quite interesting systems, but depending on their program and their function, they can actually bring people together in ways which are perhaps more accidental, that can allow accidents to take place. And perhaps they rely on these accidents, like galleries, museums, which are, multi-permeable by the public and so
Hmm.
on, as opposed to other buildings which want to eliminate these accidents, like a prison is an extremely controlled building.
Mm.
Really isolates people and puts them apart into
Mm.
their places, yeah, and monitors and controls the relationships in a very strict manner.
Mm.
I don't know if I answered your question.
No, you did. No, you did. You certainly did. Because I was thinking about it in relation to, say, the European Parliament building, which was what, 1996, 1999, which is a
Yeah.
very different animal altogether. And looking at, and it's interesting that you mentioned prisons because obviously in the book you touch on Foucault and the ideas of power that are built into his writing that he talks about, and the idea of Jeremy Bentham and the panopticon and so on and so forth. And you look at the Parliament building plan, and it's incredibly compartmentalized. And on one hand, that might look like it disables, I suppose, free movement and the possibilities of chance encounter and happenstance. On the other hand, you could say it facilitates privacy and therefore the possibility of a Labour rebel and a Tory rebel getting together and deciding on putting it could, you could consider it in that kind of way. Whereas perhaps a more modern building, a contemporary building, which has been designed very much around, I suppose, more open and discursive forms of contemporary democratic and governance practices, might disable that kind of thing and therefore push those kinds of conversations out of the Parliament building and in a way out of the oversight that the building might have, that might be enabled through that. Is that a reasonable?
Yes, I mean, I hope I haven't conveyed the idea that parliament buildings need to be this kind of probabilistic environment where lots of accidental encounters can take place. And not all parliament buildings are like the UK House
No.
of Parliament. I
No,
was
perhaps you could
really,
talk about that a bit because you talk about
yeah.
the three principal kinds, don't you?
Yes. Also, the other thing that we need to take into consideration is that most buildings need to really reconcile opposites, and there are contradictions in the program. So, for example, in parliament buildings, one key contradiction, Lawrence Vale talks about it in his book, is that designers are called to design an ideal, but at the same time, they have to really deal with the realities of the politics, yeah,
Mm.
which are not ideal at all. So there is one major contradiction there.
Hmm.
So parliaments need to perhaps generate that system of interconnections and interactions, but at the same time, they really have strong security issues to address that need to be addressed because people need to be safe when they go in the parliament. So the question for the designers become how they can really retain that openness and that possibility for interaction while at the same time they adhere to security issues. These are contradictions that are not impossible to actually achieve, to address, but they are contradictions that one needs to take into consideration.
Where have you seen this contradiction perhaps best realised? I saw in the Scottish Parliament, EMBT's Scottish Parliament building. Initially, it was an extremely open design, almost like a public thoroughfare at the end of the Royal Mile, which after 7/7, I think it was, after the London bombings, then had to kind of reframe itself using technologies of surveillance, but also just simple barriers, often enough disguised to make them look a bit nicer, but nonetheless just barriers. But are there examples where that you feel that kind of that paradox is best realized?
Ivan Harbour, in one of the essays in the book, in the last section that presents the parliament buildings and their designers, claims, I still need to visit the building to actually really see it with my own eyes, claims that they really address the security questions very well. They managed to design a building that looks really wide and open, and they use the glass, the transparency, which is oriented, the front is oriented towards the north, so that in fact the transparency, according to what he says, works much better in this way. And they managed to get the root of the public in a way that it really bypasses the security controls. So that might be one example, but as I said, I really need to visit the building and really see it.
Which building is this again?
This is the Senedd
The Senedd, yeah, okay.
Yeah, the Welsh Assembly, the Welsh
Yeah.
Parliament. Another aspect, though, it has to do not only with security, but it has to do with the way in which the building is situated in the context, in its surrounding context. So parliament buildings that are isolated, parliament buildings that were situated in, let's say, the end of a grand axis, or the side of a grand axis, like in New Delhi, yeah, the Latvians and Herbert Baker, Edwin Lutyens and Herbert Baker, old parliament in India, they make powerful statements about approachability, accessibility, and so on. The Sri Lanka parliament is located in an island. It's surrounded by water. So these things might really address security, but they don't really address accessibility, openness. The idea that the public is really invited to the building. Although that again is a contradiction in terms, because the public can ideally access the assembly chambers, and they can access certain spaces where they can look to the assembly chamber, or in the Reichstag in Berlin, they can go to the top of the building and have a fantastic view over Berlin from there, but they cannot really access many spaces. I think in reality, a parliament building is a bureaucracy building, yeah, housing a lot of committee rooms, as you said, a lot of offices, a lot of social spaces for the people that use the parliament on a daily basis, and so on. But it is not a space, it's not a building that has a large area of space dedicated to the public.
I like this idea of these different urban settings. I think that's a really critical part of it, isn't it? This idea that the building's location represents in some way something of the way that particular government or parliament wants to be represented to its own people. So if you've got something that's very embedded within the urban grain, like, for example, the Scottish Parliament building, or even to a certain extent, the Houses of Parliament, this is somehow communicating through the architecture an ideal of what democracy is to these people. Is that, I mean, with the more contemporary examples, has that been part of the discourse around it? I imagine, for example, in the example in Bangladesh that you talked about on an island, that there's this idea that they wanted to represent the democratic process as something that was almost sacred, that had almost temple-like qualities. Whereas perhaps in Britain and perhaps in other European contexts, it's more important to bed it down into a kind of relationship of reciprocity between the governed and the governors.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. It's the way you described it. And that's why symbolism, when we are dealing with representational issues, and we give too much attention to those, I think we tend to forget, and that takes us back to the beginning of our discussion. We tend to forget how spaces are instruments of politics, not only symbols of politics. So if a building is isolated from the urban fabric, then it is symbolically addressing its importance as
Mm-hmm.
a major institutional building, but not instrumentally really ensuring its importance in the sense of allowing the people to relate more directly to the building, even if they don't go inside.
Mm.
So this idea of architecture and spaces working both as symbols and as instruments is something that we made very clear in the introduction.
Yeah.
And we want to deal with both, and that perhaps most of the literature, most of the people that are really working with how institutional buildings mean, tend to emphasize symbolism and representation because this is something that registers directly to our attention. We understand it and we have words to describe it. But as I said before, we don't have words to describe how spaces are instruments.
I mentioned Foucault, and obviously you mentioned Foucault and his discourse around power. And I'm very interested in that because obviously most of the Western European countries, certainly, and if not further afield into the other parts of the European context, which the book addresses, and I think you explain the reason for the geographical kind of limits of the study very clearly and very persuasively. Most of them, as you said, are 18th and 19th century buildings derived from, built upon colonialist practices. And yet the buildings persist, and the discourse around their rightness, their fit and properness, also persists. So, for example, they're spending the better part of what, £20 billion? I don't know how much it is doing up the Houses of Parliament. I can imagine better uses of that money. I mean, they're spending £100 million on wiring, which seems quite a lot to me. I would have done it for £80 million. It would have taken a long time, but they'd have saved 20. But I find that quite interesting that at the same time, on the one hand, these buildings are quite clearly manifestations of a very historic epoch, which has no or little play in contemporary political discourse. And on the other hand, they are also still presented as the epitome of the democratic ideal.
Yes, it is absolutely true what you are saying. They were built under a completely different political system and during times of empire, during
Mm,
times of colonialism. Um, it is worth noticing that since the UK House of Parliament has been built, the UK Constitution has undergone significant changes.
mm,
So in 1807 was the Abolition of Slavery Act. So when the building was built in 1935, I think it began, yeah, because it took some years to be completed. There was
1835, not 1935.
1835, sorry, yes, exactly, not 1930. Slavery was already abolished.
Yeah.
And soon after 1807, other European countries abolished slavery. So whichever buildings were built after that were built post-slavery period.
Mm,
Nevertheless, they embody in their iconography and in their organization the notion of the empire.
mm,
Like major battles. If you visit the UK House of Parliament, you will see that the paintings, the art on the walls, and lots of other iconographical elements really celebrate a particular elite, a particular social group, a nation that ruled the waves, and it does not really represent the diversity of people that make up the UK today.
Mm.
So various attempts have taken place, but they cannot be very, very successful, obviously, because that iconography is so overwhelming and so overpowering. To address the role of women in parliament, participation, wider participation, and so on. So we do need to consider ways by which parliaments can be accessible to wider sectors of the population and to
Mhm.
diverse audiences. Nevertheless, there have been other shocks to the constitution, the British constitution, like the Irish independence, Brexit, and they have been dealt with in a way, because there is no codified institution, in a way which allowed adjustments and an evolutionary approach
Yeah.
so that the British democracy, the UK democracy, is presented as a benign system, political system,
Mm.
with a continuity that reaches back 1,000 years.
Mm.
So in the chapter that I wrote in the book we wrote with Gustavo Maldonado about the UK Houses of Parliament and the Reichstag building in Berlin, I actually make an analogy between the spatial system with its capacity to really be generative of social encounters with the constitution system in the UK, which can be flexible, yeah,
Mm.
and can adjust to really absorb these kinds of shocks.
Mm.
And this is another way in which buildings can work as instruments, in
Yeah.
fact. The parliament buildings are the homes of constitutions, even in countries which have a written constitution. It's the place where the laws are debated and are legislated.
Mm. It's quite interesting, isn't it? When there seemed, you've got the Houses of Parliament which are neo-Gothic, Pugin-like, and full of frills and rather marvelous, and makes no sense whatsoever. And it is a bit like, as you say, the form of constitution that we have, this kind of non-written constitution that we have in this country. It's a sort of, you could even call it a sort of make and do DIY approach to architecture and a DIY approach to governance. Whereas you compare it to something countries, for example, France, or even in the Capitol building in America, where you have this absolutist form, I suppose, of classicism as being the language of civic life, and it has rules, and those rules can be adhered to, and there's certain play that's permitted within, like even in the kind of development of the orders, for example, are you deploying a Corinthian? Are you deploying a Tuscan? And if you're not, why are you not? So, and they have a written constitution. And it seems to me a lovely idea that actually, as you say, the constitution is a manifestation of the architecture
Yes.
and the other way round.
Yes, I think Jonathan Sampson, who was a High Court judge, has written this book called Trials of the State, and ends up the book by saying that in countries who have a written constitution, it is far more difficult to actually make these amendments and adjustments as opposed to the UK, which has absorbed all
Yeah.
these shocks. And it was at that point that I thought, that yes, this is a really interesting parallel, an interesting analogy with the special system of the UK House of
Mm.
Parliament and the way in which people really rely on the system of corridors or on the division lobbies, where they can actually lobby their MP because they are there stuck for
Mm.
20 minutes until the process ends. And I spoke with a number of parliamentarians just before we organized the conference, asking them about the role of the special organization in the ways in which people conduct their business informally. And one of them said that quite interestingly, it hadn't occurred to them until the restrictions, which really confined people to working from home, how much they relied to being there
Mm.
to being there, to being in the building in order to actually mobilize the powers of influence, the lobbying, yeah, all those opportunities that we actually get by being in a particular place.
Mm.
So I do agree with you as well that classicism, in a way, expresses the ideals of a good citizen, the ideals of democracy, the ideas of an enlightenment, and perhaps goes hand in hand with a fixed language, like the codified in Constitution, a fixed language of meaning that is about these kinds of ideals. Whereas the Neo-Gothic expresses perhaps a culture which is rooted back in history, and a number of ideas that are rooted back in history and have evolved rather than having been adopted as the result of the social and economic restructuring that took place during the Renaissance time. Yeah, in the south of Europe.
Yes. The contemporary Parliament buildings, and you've mentioned Foster's redoing of the Reichstag, which is obviously a highly charged, I mean, possibly the most supremely charged Parliament building in Europe, including in the UK, because of relatively recent history and the need to deconstruct that relationship between governance and the governor and the people. But there's been a kind of deployment of a high modernist and in many cases high tech approach to the production of Parliament buildings. Obviously, you have the GLA headquarters by Foster's in London, but yeah, as you say, the Reichstag building, the European Union buildings, and various things. I'm kind of interested in what that is trying to talk about as well. Is there a sense that as we move into a kind of more globalized paradigm, there is an attempt to step back from deterministic architectural languages and semiotics and an attempt to create, in a way, a slightly, I suppose, blank slate? I don't want to say meaningless architecture, but an architecture that's more orientated towards practicality than perhaps cultural discourse and identity.
Perhaps technology has been always used to actually symbolize progress.
Oh, yes, I suppose.
The semantic dimensions of technology are well rooted in our culture. And maybe this type of buildings really express the future, express that a nation is really looking towards the future rather than the past, particularly in the Reichstag, which had to really dissociate itself from a troubled history. Although I think that Foster and partners, as David Nelson was saying, were quite sensitive to the troubled history of the building. So when they discovered, by removing the layers from the building, they discovered the graffiti that Russian soldiers left during the taking over of the Reichstag at the end of the Second World War. They decided to keep some of this graffiti as a reminder of a particular moment of that building's history. Regarding the sort of a universal language of Parliament buildings, perhaps that really applies to all types of buildings in terms of what language we use. I think that Parliament buildings have responsibilities to really mean at a national level and at a supranational level at the same time, and international level. Ivan Harbour, in the essay, again in the book about the Senedd, says that instead of really focusing on any kind of symbolism, they really looked at what would be the most natural way of to express the assembly of people. Like, for example, people assembling under a tree to debate, which is one of the oldest way in which people might have done that. So I found that quite moving, the way he described the Senedd. Again, I said I need to visit the building in order to really see whether the building will move me, but the way he wrote about the building really moved me and spoke about it. And he says that nothing has changed in relation to that, how people really assemble to debate, since the Parthenon in Athens. He said, if I can afford to be compared with the Parthenon, that the Senedd to be compared with the Parthenon, what we would say is nothing has really changed since then.
No.
He also discussed how the views of the sea, towards the sea, and the setting sun set really a very important dimension for the design of the building, what you would see from inside the building looking towards the outside. So these are also interesting ways to explore how you design a building and how things can mean, but from an embodied perspective.
Mm,
How do I gather, yeah, in a building? How do we gather, or what do we see when we look outside, or when we are outside of the building and look at it? Has to do with our relationship to spaces in a building from an embodied point of view,
mm,
rather than the symbol of a lotus, for example, like in the new Indian parliament, yeah, or the symbol of a peacock,
mm,
which is one of its chambers. I don't know, I don't remember if it's the upper house or the lower house, has the peacock as a symbol, the other has the lotus. Yeah, these are very recognizable, let's say, and easy to describe symbols. Whereas what I'm talking about, again, has to do with the difficulty of language
mm,
to really capture how things can mean, yeah, and how
mm.
things can work.
It's sort of the difference between a simile and a metaphor, isn't it?
Yeah, perhaps.
Yeah, the simile being that is like this, and the metaphor being some kind of, in a way, a poetic device to enable folk to encounter the thing on their own terms and to bring to it their own meanings. And I find that very interesting, and particularly as you were talking about the Senate and this idea that there is a sort of mythos that underpins the whole enterprise of democratic gathering, and that it becomes important in the design of these buildings for the architect to demonstrate, either rhetorically or visually in the design work, this lineage that pins them back to ancient Greece. We've got to be able to trace all roads, yes, exactly. Sophia, you're blushing. All roads lead back to ancient Greece, and I find that I find that very fascinating. But at the same time, in these contemporary parliamentary buildings, they also then have to tie themselves up into a global discourse around universal values of things like human rights, the rule of law,
Yes.
and even very simple things like the capacity to vote and not be pressured to vote.
Yes, exactly. And these are, yeah, in a way, they are shared across the board.
Mm. But they
Uh,
haven't been. But they haven't been before, because I mean, if we go back to the Houses of Parliament, this is about the nation state, and now we're moving into an epoch which is less concerned about notions of the nation state, much more concerned about transnationalism.
Yeah, because decisions are taken sometimes outside
Yeah,
the nation state.
yeah.
So the future of a country can be decided elsewhere.
Mhm.
Can be decided in the European Parliament.
Yeah, I mean, again, going back to Greece, the situation of Greece during the financial crisis was a case in point, where basically all of its decisions were made elsewhere.
Yeah, exactly. And in other European countries as well, like Ireland, Portugal, and so on.
Italy, Spain.
I mean, don't forget Brexit. Yeah, this
Yeah,
the one of the reasons for which Brexit took place was in order to take back control. Things are so interconnected. Things are so interconnected that this was a myth as well.
yes, I do. Yeah, I find that very, very interesting idea, and trying to kind of discern, because there's something very much like what's his name, Gottfried Semper, this idea of trying to discern where human habitation comes from, and we create these myths, or even Logier's idea of the noble savage, and the kind of primitive hut, and so on and so forth. And parliamentary buildings are subject to the same forces, even though we would probably count them as the highest forms of our cultural production.
Yes, myths are very important, like the myth of the cave, that the first buildings were caves.
Mm,
But if you look at reality, you find that there are, even before the Neolithic era, settlements and buildings that demonstrate extreme complexity,
mm.
rather than people really living in caves.
Mm. Could you tell me, just to, I mean, I suppose it would be really nice to finish on this, but the different forms of parliamentary debating chambers. Obviously, that's when you type into Google image search Parliament buildings, you either get big glossy pictures of the outsides, or you get that room where the representatives gather together to debate things. And obviously, in the Houses of Parliament, which, as you point out in the introduction to the book, every nation thinks theirs is the most natural way of doing it, and everybody else's is why would on earth they ever have a different shape? And we have
Yes.
these this chamber with these rows of seating facing each other, which is quite adversarial and quite argumentative. But there are more types than this, aren't there?
According to a study done by XML architects, and they published this very interesting book called Parliament. I have it here. They analyzed 193 parliamentary chambers. Yeah, and a really impressive effort. They concluded that there are basically 5 typologies: the opposite facing benches, the UK model, the European continental semicircular arrangement, the circle, which is a very rare type and is introduced, I think, in the 20th century, the horseshoe, which is a hybrid between the semicircular and the opposite facing benches, and the classroom. And the classroom tends to be found in authoritarian regimes, yeah, where everybody sits facing the rostrum, the speaker, and so on. This really triggered our interest with Naomi Gibson and Gustavo Maldonado to do a study of the 27 parliamentary chambers in the EU.
Mm-hmm.
And we included the UK, first because the UK was part of the EU before, and second because of its wider influence because of colonialism in countries that were under UK rule. And 3 of those are in the EU: Malta, Cyprus, and Ireland. So we decided to do a study which would look more thoroughly into the chambers, not so much from the point of view of the shape, but from the point of view of where people sit, where the major powers sit, and how they are organized, where the speaker or president of the parliament sits, where the government sits, the executive, where the legislature sits, and where actually people have to go to speak. Do they speak from the seats or they go to the rostrum to speak? So a very variegated picture emerges in the EU that shows great differences. So if I remember our percentages well, I think something like 30% of countries, in 30% of the countries, the government sits integrated with the legislature, like the UK model. Yeah, so they sit within the legislature. They don't sit facing the legislature. In the rest of the country, 70%, they either sit frontally and face the legislature frontally, yeah, and in front of the presidium, they sit in front of the presidium facing the legislature frontally, or they sit again at the front, but to the side of the speaker. Yeah? So for us, this was a very, very important step forward to really understand the dynamics of power, because there's a big difference between sitting embedded in the legislature, if you are in the government, and sitting facing the legislature. Yeah. So I think the sitting arrangement, when you are integrated in the legislature, suggests you are one of those that debate the laws of the country. You are not the authority that sits separated looking to the legislature. Also, where people sit from is a very interesting issue. Like in the UK, Houses of Parliament, the government sits and speaks from their seats. Yeah, they don't step to a rostrum to speak. They can go to the dispatch box. Yeah, but still this is integrated. So this is less formal. If you have to go to the rostrum, that's a formal act, is a way of addressing the legislature formally. We also looked at the rules of procedure, but because we could not really extend that study to the whole of the 27 countries, we just compared Belgium and the UK. And we found significant differences in the sense that in the UK, rules are more informal. It's more spontaneous, let's say, the debate, as opposed to Belgium, where people have to really indicate their interest in speaking. They can do that in the UK as well. But in the UK, the speaker can look at people that stand up, yeah, and really assign who will speak next. And then the other thing that we looked at was the dynamics of vision, because we were intrigued by that widespread view that the opposite facing benches is confrontational, as you mentioned before, as opposed to the semicircular arrangement, which indicates more cooperation. One of the parliamentarians we interviewed was Franziska Brandter from the Bundestag in Berlin. And she said No, they're just different political systems.
Mm,
So the layout has nothing to do with that. So one thing
mm,
to take into consideration is that the UK House of Parliament, the debate is a parliamentary debate. It's not like in the European countries. You know, there is an approach to the debate that has to do with putting forward an argument and then having the counter arguments.
mm.
Um, the other interesting thing when you look at the visibility, the power of visibility, is that when you look at the view that each member has from their seat, and then you overlap all these views together, what turns out is that more or less everyone sees the same number of seats and the same area. Yeah. So given the difference in proportional representation currently between the Tory party and the Labour Party, this really subtly rebalances the unequal distribution of power.
Well, fascinating.
In special terms.
Yeah. It's
Yeah.
really amazing. I just want to finish on one question. Do you have a sense through this study and through the conferences and the interactions you've had, and obviously Parliament buildings don't get built that often, but often enough. Do you have a sense of where the kind of direction of travel is in relation to this? What has become established as the norm? Is it the kind of European Parliament semicircular, almost full circular model of the European Parliament building, or is there still space within all of this for cultural and national difference?
It's interesting to look at what the team that designed the Scottish Parliament,
Mm,
Benedetta Talebu and Eric Miralles, and then Roger Stirk and Harbour did in the Scottish Parliament, the Senedd. So the Scottish Parliament is roughly semicircular, yeah, and the Senedd adopted the circle.
mm,
So two new parliaments
mm,
that did not use the opposite facing benches.
yes.
They did it specifically to deviate from that model, obviously, because of devolution, yes,
Yeah.
to really, I think, stamp their own identity.
Mm,
Um, when the parliament in India was designed by Lutyens and Baker, they also avoided the opposite facing benches in order to avoid exactly confrontation because of the sensitivity of the political situation there in
mm,
a colonized country.
mm,
So I don't think there is a general rule. I think it is what suits the country and its history.
yes.
And the way in which they understand themselves, yeah, and the way in which they want to project themselves.
Mm,
In the UK, it has a path, a historical path, because in St. Stephen's Chapel, the choirs sat opposite each other and sang opposite each other, and then that really set the precedent. So the chapel does not exist anymore, yeah, but that way of actually communicating, yeah, has outlived wars, fires, and so on. And then perhaps the last piece of information, which I thought was fascinating with my interactions with David Nelson, that was the designer of the Reichstag in Foster and Partners, he said that when they were designing the Reichstag, the parliamentary officials um, were not very happy with the circular chamber that Gunther Benisch had designed, which was based in Bonn, because it was very wide and they couldn't see the facial expressions of each other.
yes.
Yeah, and they couldn't look into the eyes,
Mm,
yeah, of each other. So they visited the UK House of Parliament, and what they appreciated was the short distance, because you can look into the eyes, yeah, of
mm,
the people that sit opposite you. But they thought it was too confrontational. So the dimensions had to be such that they could actually see into the eye,
mm.
but they went for the semicircular layout.
Really interesting. Well, thank you so much for joining me and for talking about the book. It's wonderful, and it's been a pleasure to hear you speak about it.
Thank you for inviting me. It's been an absolute pleasure to speak with you. Thank you for all these interesting questions.
As Shakespeare had Henry IV put it, when we mean to build, we first survey the plot, then draw the model. And when we see the figure of the house, then must we rate the cost of the erection. Indeed. Thank you to Sophia for taking the time to speak with me, and to UCL Press for the book. Links to it and to Sophia are in the podcast description as ever. Thanks for listening.